By the time the fifth treatise of the Corpus Hermeticum begins, the structure of reality has already been clarified, reduced, and held across multiple perspectives. What remains is not the introduction of something new, but the expression of that structure in a form that appears at first to contradict itself. God is not manifest and yet is most manifest. This is not a poetic contradiction. It is not a stylistic choice designed to create ambiguity. It is a direct statement of a relationship that cannot be expressed without tension because it describes something that does not fit within the normal structure of perception. Up to this point, the distinction between what appears and what underlies appearance has been established in multiple ways. What comes into being is perceptible. It changes, it takes form, and it can be described. What truly is does not come into being. It does not change, and it does not present itself as an object among other objects. This distinction is clear in principle. The difficulty begins when it is expressed in relation to experience. Because if what truly is does not appear in the same way as what comes into being, then it can be described as not manifest. It does not present itself directly to perception. It cannot be identified in the same way as the things that are encountered through the senses. At the same time, everything that appears depends on it completely. Nothing that comes into being exists independently. Every form, every process, every variation arises within a condition that does not change. This condition is not separate from what appears. It is what allows appearance to occur at all. From this perspective, it can be described as most manifest, not because it appears as a form, but because it is present in everything that appears. This is where the tension becomes necessary. If it is described only as not manifest, it becomes distant, abstract, and removed from experience. It is treated as something that exists beyond the world, unrelated to what is perceived. If it is described only as manifest, it becomes identified with what appears. It is reduced to form, to change, to the very processes that depend on it. Both of these descriptions lose the relationship that defines the structure. The statement holds both at once. Not manifest in the sense of not appearing as an object. Most manifest in the sense of being present in everything that appears. This cannot be resolved through simplification. It cannot be reduced to a single statement without losing part of what it expresses. This is why the text begins here. Not with explanation, but with a form that resists being flattened. Because the tendency is always to resolve tension too quickly, to choose one side of a distinction and treat it as complete, to say that what truly is either present or absent, either within the world or beyond it. The structure established in earlier treatises does not allow for that. It requires that both aspects are held simultaneously. This is what makes the statement difficult. Not because it is unclear, but because it cannot be simplified without being distorted. It demands that the relationship between being and becoming, between what appears and what underlies it, is maintained without collapsing into either extreme. From this point, the text will begin to unfold this paradox in more detail. Not by resolving it, but by clarifying how it operates within the structure that has already been established. Because once the tension is recognized, the question is no longer whether it can be resolved. It is whether it can be held without distortion. And that is where the treatise begins. Once the initial tension has been established, the key does not attempt to resolve it. Instead, it begins to clarify the structure that makes that tension necessary. The statement that what is not manifest is also most manifest depends entirely on how manifestation itself is understood. In ordinary experience, manifestation is tied to appearance. Something is considered manifest when it can be perceived, when it takes form, when it presents itself as something that can be identified and distinguished from what surrounds it. In this sense, manifestation is inseparable from change. What appears comes into being, remains for a time, and then passes away. This is the level at which perception operates. It identifies form, it distinguishes between objects, it tracks movement and variation. Through this process, a world emerges that is structured, coherent, and continuous enough to be navigated. Within this world, manifestation seems clear. What is visible is considered real, and what is not visible is often treated as absent or secondary. The text challenges this assumption. It does not deny that manifestation occurs at the level of appearance. It does not suggest that what is perceived is unreal. Instead, it questions whether appearance is the only form of manifestation, or whether manifestation itself has a deeper structure that is not immediately visible. To understand this, it becomes necessary to separate manifestation from form. Form is one way in which something can be expressed. It is the way in which something becomes perceptible. But form is not the condition that allows expression to occur. It is the result of that condition being active within the field of becoming. If manifestation is reduced to form, then anything that does not take form is treated as unmanifest. This is where the misunderstanding begins. Because what does not take form in the same way is not necessarily absent. It may simply not be accessible through perception in the way that form is. It may operate as a condition rather than as an object. This is the position that the text is pointing toward. What is described as not manifest is not absent. It is not hidden in the sense of being somewhere else. It is not waiting to appear in the way that objects appear. It is present, but not as form. This is why it can be described as most manifest. Not because it appears directly, but because everything that appears depends on it completely. It is present in every form without being reducible to any form. It is active in every process without being limited to any process. This introduces a different understanding of presence. Presence is no longer tied exclusively to visibility. It is not limited to what can be identified through perception. It includes what allows perception itself to operate. This shift is subtle, but it changes the entire framework. Because once manifestation is no longer equated with form, the relationship between what appears and what underlies it becomes more precise. What appears is no longer treated as self-sufficient. It is understood as an expression of something that is present in a different way. This does not remove the importance of form. Form remains the way in which things are encountered within experience. It remains the field in which interaction takes place. It remains necessary for engagement, for recognition, and for continuity. But it is no longer treated as the foundation. It is treated as an expression. This distinction must be held carefully, because if form is dismissed entirely, the connection between what appears and what underlies it is lost. What is foundational becomes abstract, disconnected from experience. The world becomes something to move away from, rather than something to understand in relation to what supports it. At the same time, if form is treated as the only form of manifestation, then what underlies it is overlooked. The structure collapses into appearance, and the deeper condition that allows appearance to occur is no longer recognized. The text maintains both. Form is real but dependent. What underlies form is present but not as form. This is the relationship that defines manifestation at a deeper level. And this is why the initial statement cannot be simplified. To say that what is not manifest is also most manifest is to recognize that manifestation operates at more than one level. It is not limited to what appears. It includes what allows appearance to occur at all. From this point, the text begins to move toward the implications of this for how reality is understood within experience. Because once manifestation is no longer tied exclusively to form, the way in which presence is recognized must also change. And this is where the structure becomes more demanding. Not because it becomes more complex, but because it requires a different way of holding what is already present. Once manifestation is no longer confined to form, the question shifts again. It is no longer enough to recognize that what underlies appearance is present. The difficulty becomes how that presence is understood when it does not take form in the way perception expects. Presence, in ordinary terms, is tied to identification. Something is present when it can be located, when it can be distinguished from what is around it, when it occupies a position within space and time. This is how perception confirms existence. It relies on boundaries, on contrast, on difference. Without these, recognition becomes uncertain. This is why what does not take form is often treated as absent. If it cannot be identified, it appears as though it is not there. If it does not present itself as something distinct, it does not register in the same way as what does. This creates a tendency to equate presence with visibility, and visibility with reality. The structure established in the earlier treatises does not allow for this equivalence. Because what underlies form cannot be identified in the same way as form itself. It does not occupy a position. It does not exist alongside other things as one element among many. It does not create contrast because it is what allows contrast to exist. This makes it difficult to approach. Not because it is inaccessible, but because the usual methods of recognition do not apply. It cannot be located because location depends on distinction. It cannot be described in terms of form because form is what it supports. It cannot be approached as an object because it is not one. This is where the idea of presence must be refined. Presence is no longer understood as something that stands out. It is understood as something that remains, not in the sense of remaining over time, but in the sense of being constant regardless of what changes. It is not what appears within the field of experience. It is what allows the field itself to exist. This is why it can be described as most manifest. Not because it is visible, but because it is never absent. There is no moment in which it is not present. There is no condition in which it is not active. Even when it is not recognized, it is still the condition that allows recognition to occur. This introduces a different kind of difficulty. Because what is always present does not draw attention. Attention is drawn to what changes. It moves toward difference, toward variation, toward what stands out from its surroundings. This is what allows perception to function. It requires contrast in order to identify. What is constant does not provide that contrast. It does not stand out. It does not vary. And because of this, it is easily overlooked. Not because it is hidden, but because it does not compete for attention. This is why the earlier emphasis on reorientation becomes necessary. If attention remains fixed on what changes, then what does not change will remain unrecognized, even though it is always present. This is not corrected by adding more information. It is corrected by shifting how attention operates. Not away from what appears, but within it. The recognition of presence without form does not require withdrawing from perception. It requires recognizing that what is perceived does not exhaust what is present. That within every form there is something that is not itself a form. That within every change there is something that does not change. This is not an abstract idea. It is a structural condition. And it must be held as such. Because if it is treated as an idea, it becomes something that can be accepted or rejected without affecting how experience is understood. It remains at the level of concept. The key does not allow for this. It requires that the relationship between form and what underlies it is maintained within experience itself. This is where presence without form becomes more than a statement. It becomes a condition that must be recognized continuously, not through effort, but through clarity. Clarity that what appears is not self-sufficient. Clarity that what is present is not limited to what can be seen. Clarity that what does not appear as form is not therefore absent. From this point, the text moves toward the implications of this for how existence itself is understood. Because once presence is no longer tied to form, the question becomes how existence is defined when it is not limited to what can be identified. And this is where the structure moves again, not into something new, but into a deeper expression of what has already been established. Once presence is no longer tied exclusively to form, the distinction between existence and non-existence must also be reconsidered. In ordinary understanding, existence is associated with what can be identified. Something exists when it appears, when it takes form, when it can be recognized within the field of perception. Non-existence, in contrast, is associated with absence. What does not appear is often treated as though it does not exist at all. This distinction seems clear at the level of experience, because perception operates by identifying what is present and distinguishing it from what is not. The structure established in the earlier treatises does not support this interpretation. Because what underlies form does not appear in the same way as form itself, it cannot be identified through the same processes that are used to recognize what comes into being. If existence is defined only in terms of appearance, then what does not appear will be treated as non-existent, even if it is the condition that allows appearance to occur. This is where the confusion arises. The absence of form is mistaken for the absence of existence. But these are not the same. What does not take form is not necessarily absent. It may simply not be accessible through the mode of perception that relies on distinction and identification. It may exist as a condition rather than as an object. This requires a shift in how existence itself is understood. Existence is no longer defined by visibility. It is defined by presence. And presence, as established, is not limited to what can be perceived as form. This does not mean that everything that is unseen exists in the same way. The text does not collapse all distinctions. Instead, it clarifies that existence operates at different levels, and that these levels are not equally accessible through the same means. What comes into being exists at the level of form. It can be perceived, identified, and described. What underlies becoming exists at a different level. It does not come into being. It does not take form. And because of this, it cannot be approached through the same methods. This is where the idea of non-existence must be handled carefully. Non-existence is not simply what is not perceived. It is what is not. But what is not cannot be confused with what does not appear, because what does not appear may still be present in a way that is not accessible through perception. This is why the initial statement holds both aspects at once. What is not manifest in the sense of not appearing as form. What is most manifest in the sense of being present in everything that appears. This resolves the apparent contradiction not by eliminating it, but by clarifying the levels at which each part of the statement operates. The difficulty is not in the statement itself. It is in the tendency to interpret it at a single level. If everything is reduced to the level of perception, then what does not appear will be treated as non-existent. If everything is elevated beyond perception, then what appears will be treated as insignificant. Both of these movements lose the structure. The key maintains that existence must be understood in relation to the structure that allows it to be recognized. This means holding the distinction between what appears and what underlies appearance without collapsing one into the other. This is where the earlier emphasis on alignment becomes relevant again. To be aligned with reality is to recognize the levels at which existence operates, not to deny what appears, not to dismiss what does not appear, but to understand their relationship. This understanding cannot be reduced to a concept. It must be maintained within experience, because the tendency to equate existence with appearance remains active. It is reinforced by perception. It is stabilized by habit, and it is rarely questioned because it appears to work. The key challenges this by showing that what appears is not sufficient to define what is, that existence cannot be limited to what is visible, and that what does not appear may still be the most fundamental aspect of what is. From this point, the text moves toward the implications of this for how the idea of God itself is understood within this framework. Because once existence is no longer defined by appearance, the way in which the foundational condition is described must also change. And this is where the final movement begins to take shape. Once existence is no longer defined exclusively by what appears, the way in which the idea of God is understood must also shift. The key does not introduce God as a separate entity, nor does it position God as something that exists alongside other things within the structure of reality. Instead, it returns to what has already been established and clarifies how that foundational condition is consistently misread. The misreading begins when God is approached as an object of perception. This can take many forms. It may appear as an attempt to imagine God in the same way that other things are imagined, as something that has form, location, or definable attributes. It may take the form of abstraction, where God is treated as a concept that can be described, analyzed, and understood through language alone. It may even appear as a complete rejection, where what cannot be perceived is dismissed as non-existent. In each case, the same movement is taking place. God is being treated as though it was something that could be approached through the same structures that are used to understand what comes into being. This is where the distortion occurs. Because what has been described as the foundational condition of reality cannot be reduced to the level of what it allows to exist, it cannot be contained within the same framework as the forms and processes that depend on it. To attempt to do so is to reverse the relationship. What underlies everything is treated as though it were one thing among many. This reduces it. It shifts it from being the condition of existence to being an element within existence. The key corrects this by returning to the paradox with greater precision. God is not manifest in the sense that God does not appear as form. There is no object that can be identified as God within the field of perception. There is nothing that can be pointed to and said to represent the whole. At the same time, God is most manifest in the sense that nothing exists apart from that condition. Every form, every process, every instance of becoming depends entirely on what does not come into being. This is not a theological claim in the conventional sense. It is a structural one. It describes the relationship between what appears and what allows appearance. The misreading occurs when this relationship is collapsed. If God is treated as manifest in the same way as objects, then God becomes limited to form. The infinite is reduced to the finite. What underlies everything is treated as though it were one part of what it underlies. If God is treated as not manifest in the sense of being entirely absent from what appears, then the connection between foundation and expression is lost. The world becomes separate from what allows it to exist. The relationship that defines the structure disappears. The key does not allow either interpretation. It maintains that God cannot be identified as a form and yet is present in all forms. This requires a different way of understanding presence. Not as something that stands apart, but as something that remains within everything without being reducible to any single instance. This is where the earlier distinctions converge. Unity, intellect, knowledge, and alignment all point toward this same condition. They describe different aspects of the same relationship. And when that relationship is held correctly, the misreading begins to fall away. Not because a new idea replaces it, but because the structure that supported it is no longer maintained. The difficulty is that this misreading is persistent. It is reinforced by the way perception operates. It is supported by language which tends to describe things as though they exist independently and can be defined in isolation. It is stabilized by habit, which treats what is most familiar as sufficient. Because of this, the correction cannot be a single act. It must be maintained, not by rejecting perception or abandoning language, but by recognizing their limits and holding them in relation to what they depend on. This is where the understanding of God becomes precise, not as something that can be captured, not as something that can be reduced to description, but as the condition that allows everything to be, without itself becoming one of the things that is. From this point, the text moves toward its final movement, not to conclude the idea, but to restate it in its most reduced and stable form. Because once the misreading has been exposed, what remains is not a new interpretation, but the need to hold the relationship without distortion. And this is where the treatise comes to its end. By the conclusion of this fifth treatise, the apparent contradiction that opened the text is no longer something that requires resolution. It has been clarified as a statement that reflects the structure of reality when it is understood across more than one level at once. What is not manifest because it does not appear as form, it does not come into being, it does not take shape, and it cannot be identified within the field of perception in the way that objects can. What is most manifest because nothing that appears exists independently of it. Every form, every process, every instance of becoming depends on a condition that does not itself become. This relationship has now been held from multiple angles. Manifestation has been separated from form. Presence has been distinguished from visibility. Existence has been clarified beyond what can be identified. And the idea of God has been returned to its structural position, not as an object within reality, but as the condition that allows reality to be. None of this introduces something new. It refines what has already been established. The structure remains consistent. What has changed is the level of precision with which it is held. This is what defines the role of this treatise within the broader movement of the Corpus Hermeticum. It does not expand the system. It forces it into a form that cannot be simplified without distortion. Because the tendency, once a structure has been understood, is to reduce it in ways that make it easier to hold, to remove tension, to collapse distinctions, to treat what is foundational as though it were either absent or fully contained within what appears. This text does not allow that. It maintains the tension, not as something unresolved, but as something necessary. Because the relationship between what appears and what underlies it cannot be expressed without holding both at once. If one is removed, the structure collapses. This is why the language remains paradoxical, not to obscure meaning, but to prevent it from being flattened, to keep the relationship intact. This introduces a different kind of stability. Not stability through simplification, but stability through precision. To remain aligned with this structure is not to resolve the paradox. It is to hold it without distortion. To recognize that what does not appear is not therefore absent. To recognize that what appears is not therefore self-sufficient. To recognize that what underlies everything is present in everything without becoming any one thing. This is not a conclusion that can be reached and then set aside. It is a condition that must be maintained. Because the tendency to collapse the structure remains active, perception continues to operate in terms of form. Language continues to divide and define. Experience continues to present itself as though what appears is complete. Without the continued recognition of what underlies this, the earlier condition returns. Not dramatically, but gradually. Clarity fades. Distinction becomes less precise. The structure remains, but it is no longer held. This is why the text does not end with a final statement that resolves the tension. It ends by reinforcing the condition that must be maintained. Not as belief, not as doctrine, but as clarity. Clarity that what is most fundamental does not appear as what is most visible. Clarity that what is most present does not present itself as an object. Clarity that what allows everything to be cannot be reduced to any single instance of being. From this position, the movement of the Corpus Hermeticum continues, not by introducing a different structure, but by approaching the same structure from new angles, each time requiring that it is held with the same level of precision. Because once the relationship has been recognized, the task is no longer to discover it. It is to remain aligned with it. And that alignment is the only way the structure remains intact within experience. By the time the sixth treatise begins, the structure of reality has already been clarified in terms of what appears and what underlies it, what comes into being and what does not, what is perceived and what is recognized through intellect. The earlier paradoxes have established that what is most fundamental does not present itself as form, and yet is present in everything that appears. This treatise shifts the emphasis again, not toward paradox, but toward precision. In God alone is good, and elsewhere nowhere. This is not presented as a moral statement in the conventional sense. It is not describing behavior, preference, or judgment. It is not concerned with what is considered good or bad within the field of human experience. It is defining good in structural terms. This changes everything. Because if good is treated as something that belongs to action, to intention, or to outcome, then it remains within the field of becoming. It becomes something that varies. It appears in some places and not in others. It can be increased, decreased, or altered depending on conditions. The text does not allow for this. It removes good from the field of variation and places it at the level of what does not change. Good is not something that comes into being. It is not something that can be produced. It is not something that can be lost. It is what is. This is why it is said to exist only in God. Because God, as established, is not an object within reality, but the condition that allows reality to be. It does not change. It does not vary. It does not come into being or pass away. If good is located at this level, then it shares those same characteristics. It is constant. It is not subject to variation. And it cannot be found within what changes in the same way that change is found. This is where the difficulty begins. Because experience is structured around variation. What is encountered changes. What is perceived differs from moment to moment. What is interpreted as good in one situation may be interpreted differently in another. This creates the sense that good is something that exists within the world as it is experienced. The treatise challenges this directly. It states that what is encountered within the field of becoming is not good in itself. It may participate in what is good. It may reflect it to varying degrees, but it does not contain it as something that belongs to it independently. This introduces a distinction that must be held carefully. If good is removed entirely from the world of experience, then everything that appears may be treated as equally disconnected from what is fundamental. This leads to a kind of indifference in which nothing is recognized as participating in what is good. At the same time, if good is located within particular forms or actions as though it belongs to them, then it becomes variable. It becomes something that can be measured, compared, and altered within the field of becoming. Both of these interpretations lose the structure. The key maintains that good belongs only to what does not change, and that what changes can only participate in it. This participation is not stable. It varies. Because what comes into being is not constant. It does not hold the condition of good within itself. It reflects it, expresses it, or obscures it, depending on its alignment with what underlies it. This returns the idea of good to the same structure that has already been established. It is not something added to reality. It is not something that emerges from processes. It is not something that can be isolated within particular instances. It is what is constant within the structure itself. This is why the statement is absolute. In God alone is good, and elsewhere nowhere. Not because nothing in the world has value, but because value does not originate in the world of becoming. It originates in what allows that world to exist. From this point, the text will begin to clarify what this means for how the world is understood, and how what appears is related to what is good without being identical to it. Because once good is no longer treated as something that belongs to what changes, the relationship between what appears and what is fundamental must be redefined with greater precision. And this is where the treatise begins to unfold. Once good has been removed from the field of variation, it can no longer be understood as a quality that belongs to things. This is the first major shift that the treatise demands. Good is not something that can be attached to objects, actions, or outcomes in the way that other qualities are. A quality belongs to something that comes into being. It can be observed, compared, and evaluated. It can increase or decrease. It can appear under certain conditions and disappear under others. Qualities depend on the forms in which they are expressed, and because those forms change, the qualities associated with them change as well. If good were a quality, it would follow this pattern. It would vary. It would depend on circumstances. It would be present in some cases and absent in others. This is how it is commonly understood within experience. Something is considered good because it produces a desired outcome, or because it aligns with a particular standard, or because it is judged to be beneficial in a specific context. In each case, good is treated as something that belongs to the situation. The text does not allow this. It separates good from the conditions in which it appears. Good is not what is judged. It is what allows judgment to have meaning at all. This requires a shift away from thinking in terms of evaluation and toward thinking in terms of condition. A condition is not something that belongs to a form. It is what allows forms to exist. It does not vary with the forms that depend on it. It remains constant, even as those forms change. This is how good is being defined here. Not as something that is applied to what appears, but as something that underlies the possibility of anything appearing as meaningful or valuable. This does not remove the experience of variation. Within the field of becoming, things will continue to be interpreted as better or worse, more or less aligned, more or less coherent. These distinctions remain part of how perception operates, but they are no longer treated as defining what good is. They are treated as reflections, degrees of participation, indicators of alignment or misalignment with what is constant. This is where the relationship between good and what appears must be held carefully. Because if good is treated as entirely separate from the world, then what appears loses its connection to what underlies it. The structure becomes divided, and what is experienced is no longer understood as participating in what is fundamental. At the same time, if good is treated as belonging to what appears, then it becomes subject to change. It is reduced to something that can be produced or lost, increased or diminished, depending on conditions. Both positions lose the structure. The treatise maintains that what appears participates in good without containing it. This participation is not equal across all forms. Some forms reflect the underlying condition more clearly than others. Some align more closely with what is constant, while others obscure it. But even in this variation, good itself does not change. What changes is the degree to which it is expressed. This distinction becomes essential, because without it, the entire framework collapses back into the level of perception. Good becomes something that is determined by circumstance, and the idea of a constant condition disappears. The text prevents this by maintaining that good does not belong to what comes into being. It belongs to what does not. This is why it is said to exist only in God, not as a possession but as identity. God is not something that has good. God is what good is. This removes any possibility of treating good as something that can be separated from its source. It cannot be transferred. It cannot be distributed. It cannot be located within particular instances as though it were contained there. It is present only as a condition, and everything that appears participates in it to the extent that it remains aligned with that condition. From this point, the text begins to examine what this means for how the world is understood. Because once good is no longer treated as a quality, the way in which what appears is evaluated must also change. Evaluation can no longer define what is good. It can only indicate the degree to which what appears reflects or obscures what is already constant. And this is where the structure becomes more precise. Not more complex, but less open to distortion. Because once good is fixed at the level of what does not change, it cannot be redefined by what does. And everything that follows must be understood in relation to that. Once good is established as a condition rather than a quality, the question shifts toward how what comes into being relates to that condition. If good does not belong to things, but things participate in it, then the structure of that participation becomes central. Participation is not ownership. What comes into being does not contain good within itself. It does not produce it, and it does not hold it as something that belongs to it independently. Instead, it reflects it to varying degrees depending on its alignment with what underlies it. This introduces variation without altering the condition itself. Good remains constant. What changes is the extent to which it is expressed. This is where misalignment becomes possible. Because what comes into being is not fixed. It changes, it moves, it varies, and in doing so, it can either reflect the underlying condition more clearly or obscure it. This is not a moral failing in the conventional sense. It is a structural condition. Misalignment occurs when what appears is treated as self-sufficient, when it is no longer recognized as dependent on what underlies it. When this happens, the connection between form and condition weakens. What appears begins to operate as though it exists independently, and in doing so, it no longer reflects the structure that allows it to exist. This is what the text is identifying. Not the presence of evil as something that exists in its own right, but the absence of alignment with what is good. This distinction is important, because if evil is treated as something that exists independently, then it becomes another condition alongside good. It gains a kind of stability that the text does not support. Instead, what is described as evil is the result of misalignment. It is what appears when the relationship between what comes into being and what does not is no longer held. This does not create a new condition. It removes the expression of the existing one. This is why misalignment does not produce something fundamentally new. It distorts what is already present. It alters the way in which what appears reflects what underlies it. This can be seen in how experience is structured. When alignment is present, what appears is coherent. It is understood in relation to what does not change. There is clarity about the dependence of form on condition. Variation is recognized without being treated as foundational. When alignment is not present, this coherence breaks down. What appears is treated as complete. It is taken as self-sufficient. The underlying condition is no longer recognized, and as a result, what appears loses its relation to what gives it meaning. This is where confusion arises. Not because something new has been introduced, but because what was already present is no longer being held. This is why the text does not describe evil as something that exists in the same way as good. Good is constant. Misalignment is variable. Good is foundational. Misalignment is dependent. Good does not change. Misalignment appears as change. This asymmetry must be maintained. Because if it is not, the structure collapses into dualism, where good and evil are treated as equal and opposing forces. This is not what the text supports. There is no second condition. There is only the presence or absence of alignment with what is. This returns the focus to the role of recognition. Alignment is not something that is created. It is something that is maintained. Misalignment is not something that is introduced. It is what remains when alignment is no longer held. This is why the emphasis is not on producing good, but on recognizing it. Not on eliminating evil as though it were an independent force, but on maintaining the relationship that allows what is good to be expressed. From this point, the text moves toward the implications of this for how human experience is structured. Because if what appears can either reflect or obscure what underlies it, then the way in which perception operates becomes central. And this is where the structure continues to unfold. Once participation and misalignment have been clarified, the focus moves toward the mechanism through which misalignment becomes stable within experience. This mechanism is perception, not in the sense that perception is flawed in itself, but in the sense that it operates in a way that can obscure the relationship between what appears and what underlies it. Perception is oriented toward change. It identifies difference, variation, and movement. It distinguishes between forms, tracks, processes, and allows for interaction with what comes into being. Without it, there would be no coherent experience of the world as it is encountered. This is not a problem. It is a necessary function. The difficulty arises when perception is treated as sufficient. When what is perceived is taken as complete, the underlying condition that allows perception to operate is no longer recognized. What appears is treated as though it exists independently, and the relationship between form and condition begins to dissolve. This is how distortion takes hold. Not through the introduction of something false, but through the omission of what is fundamental. What is perceived remains real at its level. Forms still appear. Processes still unfold. Variation still occurs. But without the recognition of what underlies these, the interpretation of what is perceived becomes incomplete. This incompleteness is not immediately obvious, because perception continues to function effectively within its domain. It allows for navigation, interaction, and continuity. It produces a world that appears coherent and self-contained. This apparent coherence reinforces the assumption that nothing more is needed, that what is seen is what is. This is where distortion stabilizes. Because once this assumption is in place, the relationship between what appears and what does not appear is no longer considered. The underlying condition is not denied directly. It is simply not included in the structure of understanding. This creates a closed system, one in which everything is explained in terms of what comes into being without reference to what allows it to come into being. Within this system, variation becomes the basis of knowledge. Change becomes the foundation of explanation. And what does not change is no longer recognized as relevant. This is the condition that the text is addressing. Not by rejecting perception, but by repositioning it. Perception must remain active. It must continue to engage with what appears. But it cannot define what is. It must be held in relation to intellect, which recognizes what does not change within what does. Without this relation, perception becomes the sole authority. And when it does, distortion is inevitable. Because what changes cannot account for itself. It depends on something that does not change. When that dependency is not recognized, the structure collapses into appearance. This collapse is not dramatic. It is gradual. It appears as certainty. What is perceived feels complete. It feels sufficient. It feels as though nothing is missing. This is what makes distortion difficult to identify. It does not appear as confusion. It appears as clarity. But it is clarity within a reduced framework. A framework that excludes the condition that allows it to exist. This is why the earlier emphasis on alignment becomes necessary again. Alignment is not achieved by rejecting perception. It is achieved by maintaining its relationship to what underlies it. Perception continues to present what changes. Intellect continues to recognize what does not. And the relationship between the two must remain intact. This is what prevents distortion from stabilizing. Not by removing variation, but by situating it correctly. Not by denying what appears, but by recognizing that what appears is not self-sufficient. From this point, the text moves toward the implications of this for how alignment is maintained within experience. Because once distortion is understood as the result of misplacing perception, the question becomes how that placement is corrected and sustained. And this is where the structure moves again. Not into something new, but into a more precise expression of what has already been established. Once distortion is understood as the result of misplacing perception, the question becomes how alignment is maintained within conditions that constantly reinforce that misplacement. The structure has already been clarified. What changes is not the structure itself, but the consistency with which it is held. Alignment is not established once and then secured permanently. It must be maintained. This is not because the structure changes, but because the conditions of experience do not remain stable. What appears continues to vary. Perception continues to engage with that variation. Attention continues to move toward what changes, because change demands response. Within this movement, what does not change does not assert itself. It does not draw attention. It does not compete with what appears. This creates a constant tendency toward misalignment, not as a deliberate shift, but as a gradual drift. The relationship between what appears and what underlies it is not actively rejected. It is simply no longer held with the same clarity. What is most immediate becomes what is assumed to be complete. This is where alignment must be sustained. Not by resisting what appears, but by maintaining the recognition of what it depends on. This recognition must remain active. If it becomes passive, it begins to dissolve. Because perception continues to reinforce its own structure. It presents a world that appears coherent and self-contained. It provides enough stability to function within that world. It does not require reference to what underlies it in order to operate effectively at its own level. This is why misalignment can feel stable. Because it works. It allows for interaction, for decision-making, for continuity. It provides a sense of clarity that is sufficient within the field of becoming. But it is incomplete. And that incompleteness becomes visible only when the relationship to what does not change is considered. This is where attention becomes central. Not attention as effort, but attention as recognition. Recognition of when perception begins to assert itself as sufficient. Recognition of when what appears is being treated as self-sufficient. Recognition of when the underlying condition is no longer being held within the structure of understanding. This recognition is what allows alignment to be maintained. Not by forcing perception to change, but by situating it correctly. This is a subtle movement. It does not require withdrawing from experience. It does not require altering what appears. It requires maintaining clarity about what is taking place. What appears continues to appear. What changes continues to change. But what does not change must remain recognized within that movement. This is what prevents alignment from collapsing. Not the elimination of variation, but the preservation of relationship. This relationship must remain continuous. It cannot be activated only at certain moments and then set aside, because the conditions that produce misalignment are continuous. Perception does not pause. Variation does not stop. The tendency to treat what appears as complete remains active at all times. This is why alignment is not a state. It is a condition that must be sustained within changing states. This distinction is essential. Because if alignment is treated as a state, it will be approached as something that can be reached and then maintained automatically. When that state shifts, alignment will appear to be lost, and the process will begin again. The text does not support this. Alignment is not dependent on a particular state. It is dependent on clarity. Clarity that what appears is not self-sufficient. Clarity that what does not appear is not therefore absent. Clarity that what changes depends entirely on what does not. This clarity must remain present regardless of the conditions of experience. From this position, the text moves toward its final movement. Not to introduce a new idea, but to restate the structure in its most reduced form now that the role of alignment has been fully established. Because once alignment is understood as something that must be maintained, the only thing that remains is to hold the structure without distortion. And that is where the treatise comes to its conclusion. By the conclusion of this sixth treatise, the statement that opened it no longer reads as an assertion that needs to be interpreted in isolation. It has been clarified as a structural position that depends on everything that has already been established in the earlier texts. In God alone is good, and elsewhere nowhere. This is not a claim about behavior, preference, or moral judgment. It is not concerned with what is considered good within the shifting conditions of experience. It defines good in relation to what does not change. Good has been removed from the field of variation. It is no longer treated as something that belongs to what comes into being. It cannot be produced, altered, or lost within the processes that unfold at the level of perception. It does not appear in some instances and disappear in others. It remains constant. This is why it is located in God, not as something that God possesses, but as what God is within the structure that has been established. God is not an object within reality. God is the condition that allows reality to be. If good belongs only to what does not change, then it belongs only to that condition. Everything that appears participates in it. Nothing that appears contains it. This distinction has been held from multiple angles. Participation introduces variation without altering what is constant. What comes into being can reflect what is good to varying degrees. depending on its alignment with what underlies it. This variation is real, but it does not affect the condition itself. Misalignment does not create a second condition. It does not introduce an opposing force. It is the absence of alignment with what is already present. This removes any sense of symmetry between good and what is not good. Good is foundational. Misalignment is dependent. Good does not change. Misalignment appears as change. This asymmetry must remain intact, because if it is lost, the structure collapses into a system in which good and evil are treated as equal and opposing forces. This is not what the text supports. There is no second foundation. There is only the presence or absence of alignment with what is. This returns the focus to perception and its role in sustaining or distorting that alignment. Perception continues to operate. It continues to engage with what appears. It continues to produce a world that is coherent enough to be navigated. But it cannot define what is good. It can only reflect the degree to which what appears is aligned with what does not change. This is where distortion takes hold when the relationship is lost. What appears is treated as complete. What changes is treated as foundational. And the underlying condition is no longer recognized within the structure of understanding. Alignment restores that relationship, not by rejecting what appears, but by situating it correctly. Not by denying variation, but by recognizing that variation depends on what does not vary. This recognition must be maintained, not as an idea, but as clarity within experience. Because the conditions that produce misalignment do not disappear. They remain active. Perception continues to present what changes as though it were complete. Attention continues to move toward what varies. Without the continued recognition of what underlies this, alignment fades. And what remains is a return to the earlier condition in which what appears is treated as self-sufficient. This is why the text does not end with a resolution. It ends with a condition in which the structure has been clarified, reduced, and held, and must now be maintained without distortion. From this position, the movement of the Corpus Hermeticum continues, not by introducing a different structure, but by approaching the same structure from new angles, each time requiring that it is held with the same level of precision. Because once the relationship has been recognized, the task is no longer to discover it. It is to remain aligned with it. And that alignment is the only way what has been revealed remains intact within experience. By the time the seventh treatise begins, the structure has already been clarified to a point where the relationship between what appears and what underlies it, between what changes and what does not, between perception and intellect, no longer requires expansion. What changes here is the tone. The greatest evil among men is ignorance of God. This is not framed as a philosophical observation. It is stated directly. And that directness shifts the weight of the entire system. Because up to this point, what has been described could still be approached as a way of understanding reality, a framework for interpretation, a structure that clarifies how things relate to one another. This statement removes that distance. It does not describe ignorance as a limitation. It defines it as the central problem. This requires precision. Because ignorance, in this context, is not the absence of information. It is not a lack of knowledge in the sense of not having encountered certain ideas or explanations. it is something more structural. It is the failure to recognize what underlies everything that appears. This failure does not remove what underlies. It removes its recognition, and in doing so, it alters the way everything that appears is understood. This is why it is described as the greatest evil. Not because it introduces something negative as a separate force, but because it removes the condition that allows what is good to be recognized. This connects directly to what has already been established. Good exists only in what does not change. Everything that appears participates in it to the extent that it is aligned with that condition. If that condition is not recognized, then participation cannot be understood. What appears is treated as self-sufficient. And once that happens, the entire structure collapses into appearance. This is the effect of ignorance. Not confusion, but misplacement. Reality is still experienced. Perception continues to function, but what is experienced is no longer understood in relation to what underlies it. This produces a world that appears complete, a system that seems coherent, but one that is disconnected from its foundation. This is why ignorance is not neutral. It is not simply a lack. It actively distorts the relationship between what appears and what is. This distortion does not need to be dramatic. It is often stable. It presents itself as clarity, as certainty, as the assumption that what is seen is what is. This is what makes it difficult to recognize, because it does not feel like ignorance. It feels like understanding. This is where the text begins, not by introducing a new structure, but by identifying the condition that prevents that structure from being held. And by doing so, it shifts the focus from what is to be understood to what prevents understanding from remaining intact. From this point, the treatise will begin to examine how this ignorance operates and how it shapes the way reality is interpreted when what underlies it is no longer recognized. Because once the foundation is removed from the structure of understanding, everything that follows must be reconsidered. And that is where the text moves next. Once ignorance has been identified as the central problem, it becomes necessary to understand how it operates. If it was simply the absence of knowledge, it could be corrected by the addition of information. But the text does not treat it this way. Ignorance, in this context, has structure. It is not empty. It is active. It shapes the way reality is interpreted. This is why it can persist even in the presence of information. A person may encounter explanations, concepts, and frameworks that describe the structure of reality accurately and yet remain within ignorance. This is possible because ignorance is not defined by what is known at the level of language. It is defined by how what is known is held. If the relationship between what appears and what underlies it is not recognized, then the addition of information does not correct the problem. It is absorbed into the existing structure of misunderstanding. This is how ignorance stabilizes. It does not resist knowledge. It reorganizes it. What is encountered is interpreted in terms of what is already assumed. New ideas are placed within the framework of perception rather than being allowed to reorient it. The underlying condition remains unrecognized even as it is being described. This produces a particular kind of clarity, one that is internally consistent but structurally incomplete, because the foundation is missing. This is why ignorance does not appear as confusion. It appears as certainty. What is perceived feels complete. The relationships between things can be described. Patterns can be identified. Systems can be constructed that explain how things behave within the field of becoming. All of this can function effectively, but it does so without reference to what allows that field to exist. This creates a closed system, one in which everything is explained in terms of what comes into being, without recognizing the condition that makes becoming possible. Within this system, variation becomes the basis of understanding. Change becomes the foundation. What does not change is no longer recognized as relevant because it does not appear within the processes that are being examined. This is how ignorance becomes stable, not because it is defended explicitly, but because it is reinforced by the way perception operates. Perception identifies difference. It tracks change. It builds continuity from variation. This produces a world that appears coherent and self-contained. And because it functions, it is trusted. This trust is what allows ignorance to persist, not as a deliberate rejection of what underlies reality, but as a failure to recognize that anything more is required. This is why the text defines ignorance as the greatest evil. Not because it introduces something separate from what is good, but because it removes the condition that allows what is good to be recognized. Without that recognition, alignment becomes impossible. What appears is treated as self-sufficient. And once that happens, the structure collapses into appearance. This collapse is not immediate. It develops over time. Assumptions become fixed. Interpretations become habitual. What is most immediate becomes what is taken as real. And because this process is continuous, it does not draw attention to itself. It becomes the background against which everything else is understood. This is the structure of ignorance. Not the absence of knowledge, but the misplacement of it. Not the lack of clarity, but clarity within a reduced framework. This is what must be corrected. Not by adding more information, but by restoring the relationship that has been lost. Because once that relationship is recognized, the structure of ignorance begins to dissolve. Not through opposition, but through reorientation. From this point, the text moves toward how this reorientation takes place. Because if ignorance is structural, then its correction must also be structural. And this is where the treatise continues. Once the structure of ignorance is understood, the next difficulty becomes more precise. Ignorance does not simply obscure understanding. It produces a form of clarity that feels complete, even when it is not. This is what allows it to persist. If ignorance appeared as confusion, it would draw attention to itself. It would create a sense that something is missing. It would open the possibility for correction because the absence of clarity would be recognized. But this is not how it operates. It produces clarity within a reduced framework. Everything that appears can still be described. Relationships between things can still be understood. Patterns can still be recognized. Systems can still be constructed that explain how the world behaves at the level of becoming. Within this field, understanding appears stable. It functions. It allows for prediction, for interaction, for continuity. And because it works, it is trusted. This trust is what gives false clarity its strength. Because once something is experienced as clear and functional, it is no longer questioned. It becomes the basis for further interpretation. New information is absorbed into it. The framework expands, but it does not change at its foundation. This is where certainty becomes misplaced. Certainty in itself is not the problem. The problem is where it is located. If certainty is placed within what changes, then it becomes attached to forms, processes, and interpretations that are themselves unstable. What appears to be fixed is in fact dependent on conditions that are constantly shifting. This creates a contradiction that is not immediately visible. What is treated as certain is not stable, and what is stable is not recognized. This inversion is what defines misplaced certainty. It does not feel like uncertainty. It feels like confidence. What is perceived is taken as sufficient. What is understood within that perception is treated as complete. There is no need to look beyond what appears, because what appears seems to provide everything that is required. This is where the structure closes in on itself. What is seen defines what is real. What is real defines what is understood. And what is understood reinforces what is seen. This loop is self-sustaining. It does not require external support. It maintains itself through the consistency of perception and the stability of interpretation within that perception. This is why false clarity is difficult to disrupt. Not because it is complex, but because it is coherent. It forms a complete system at its own level. But it is complete only within its own limits. It does not include the condition that allows it to exist. This is where the earlier distinction becomes critical again. Perception presents what changes. Intellect recognizes what does not. If intellect is not active within the structure of understanding, then perception becomes the sole authority. What is recognized through perception is treated as complete, and what is not recognized through perception is excluded. This exclusion is not deliberate. It is structural. What does not appear is not considered. And because it is not considered, it does not form part of the system of understanding. This is how certainty becomes misplaced. It is not attached to what is constant. It is attached to what is most immediate. This creates a form of stability that is convincing but not fundamental. It holds as long as the conditions of perception remain consistent. But it does not extend beyond them. This is why the text identifies ignorance as the greatest problem. Because it does not prevent understanding from forming. It allows understanding to form in a way that excludes what is most fundamental. This exclusion is what must be corrected, not by rejecting what is already understood, but by reorienting it, by restoring the relationship between what appears and what underlies it, by recognizing that what is perceived is not self-sufficient, and by shifting certainty away from what changes toward what does not. This is not a replacement of one form of certainty with another. It is a relocation. Certainty must be grounded in what is stable, not in what varies. From this point, the text moves toward how this reorientation affects the way experience itself is understood. Because once certainty is no longer attached to what appears, the structure of interpretation must also change. And this is where the treatise continues to unfold. Once false clarity and misplaced certainty have been recognized, the question shifts again. It is no longer enough to identify the structure of ignorance. The focus becomes how understanding is reoriented so that the relationship between what appears and what underlies it is restored. This reorientation is not achieved through accumulation. It is not a matter of adding more information, refining concepts, or constructing more detailed explanations within the existing framework. Because if the framework itself is misaligned, then any addition will be absorbed into that misalignment. This is why correction cannot occur at the level of content. It must occur at the level of structure. The relationship between perception and intellect must be restored. Perception continues to operate as it always has. It presents what changes. It identifies form, variation, and movement. It provides the field within which experience unfolds. This does not change. What changes is how perception is situated. It is no longer treated as sufficient. It is no longer the sole basis for understanding. It is recognized as one aspect of a broader structure that includes what does not change. This is where intellect becomes active again, not as analysis in the conventional sense, but as recognition of what remains constant within what varies. It does not replace perception. It does not reject what appears. It situates it. This creates a shift that is subtle but fundamental. What appears is no longer treated as self-sufficient. It is understood as dependent, not in a theoretical sense, but within experience itself. This reorientation does not remove the world of becoming. It clarifies it. Forms continue to appear. Processes continue to unfold. Variation continues. But none of this is taken as foundational. It is understood in relation to what allows it to occur. This is where understanding begins to stabilize. Not because what appears becomes fixed, but because what underlies it is recognized as constant. This recognition provides a point of reference that does not change. And because it does not change, it allows what does change to be understood without being mistaken for the foundation of reality. This is the function of reorientation. It does not replace one set of ideas with another. It restores a relationship. The relationship between what appears and what does not appear. Between what changes and what does not. Between what is perceived and what is recognized through intellect. This restoration alters the way everything is interpreted. What was previously treated as complete is now understood as partial. What was taken as foundational is now recognized as dependent. What was assumed to be self-sufficient is now seen in relation to what supports it. This does not create instability. It creates precision. Because once the structure is correctly aligned, interpretation no longer depends solely on what appears. It is grounded in what does not change. This grounding prevents the return to false clarity. Not by removing perception, but by ensuring that perception does not operate in isolation. This is where reorientation must be maintained. It is not a single shift. It is an ongoing condition. Because the tendency to return to perception as the sole authority remains active. What appears continues to draw attention. What changes continues to dominate experience. Without the continued recognition of what underlies this, the structure begins to collapse again into appearance. This is why reorientation is not complete once it occurs. It must be sustained, not through effort, but through clarity. Clarity that what appears is not sufficient. Clarity that what does not appear is not therefore absent. Clarity that understanding depends on holding both within the same structure. From this point, the text moves toward how this clarity is maintained within experience. Because once understanding has been reoriented, the question becomes how it remains stable within conditions that constantly reinforce the earlier structure of ignorance. And this is where the treatise continues. Once understanding has been reoriented, the task does not end. The structure has been clarified. The relationship between what appears and what underlies it has been restored, and the position of perception within that structure has been correctly situated. What remains is the question of how this clarity is sustained. Clarity in this context is not a moment of insight. It is not a state that is reached and then held without effort. It is a condition that must remain active within experience. This is necessary because the conditions that produced ignorance have not been removed. Perception continues to operate. Variation continues to unfold. What appears continues to present itself as though it were complete. This creates a constant pressure toward returning to the earlier structure. Not as a conscious decision, but as a natural tendency. Attention moves toward what changes. It follows movement, contrast, and difference. This is how perception functions. And because it functions effectively within its domain, it continues to be trusted. This trust is what allows the earlier structure of ignorance to reassert itself, not as confusion, but as familiarity. What is most immediate becomes what is assumed to be sufficient. This is why clarity must be sustained. Not by resisting perception, but by maintaining its correct position within the structure of understanding. Perception must remain active. It must continue to engage with what appears, but it cannot define what is. It must be held in relation to what does not change. This relation must remain present. If it fades even slightly, the structure begins to shift. What appears becomes more prominent. What underlies it becomes less immediate. The relationship between them becomes less clear. This is how clarity dissolves, gradually, without drawing attention to itself. This is why sustaining clarity requires recognition. Recognition of when perception begins to assert itself as sufficient. Recognition of when what appears is being treated as foundational. Recognition of when the underlying condition is no longer being held within the structure of understanding. This recognition does not require effort in the sense of control. It requires attention. Attention to what is taking place within experience. Attention to how understanding is being formed. Attention to whether the relationship between what appears and what does not appear is being maintained. This attention is what allows clarity to remain, not as a fixed state, but as an ongoing condition. This condition does not remove variation. It does not stabilize what changes. It stabilizes the recognition of what does not change within that variation. This is what prevents the return to ignorance, not by eliminating the possibility of misalignment, but by maintaining awareness of when it begins to take shape. Because misalignment does not appear fully formed, it develops. It begins as a slight shift in attention, a subtle emphasis on what appears, a gradual reduction in the recognition of what underlies it. If this shift is not recognized, it continues. It becomes stable, and the earlier structure returns. This is why sustaining clarity is not optional. It is necessary, not as an additional step, but as the continuation of the structure that has already been established. From this point, the text moves toward its final movement, not to introduce a new idea, but to restate the entire structure in its most reduced form, now that the role of ignorance and clarity has been fully clarified. Because once the problem has been identified and the correction has been made, what remains is to hold that correction without distortion. And this is where the treatise comes to its conclusion. By the conclusion of this 7th treatise, the statement that opened it has been clarified in a way that no longer depends on interpretation at the level of language alone. The greatest evil among men is ignorance of God, has been shown to describe a structural condition, not a moral judgment. Ignorance is not defined as a lack of information. It is defined as the failure to recognize what underlies everything that appears. This failure does not remove the underlying condition. It removes its recognition. And in doing so, it alters the way everything that appears is understood. This is why ignorance is not neutral. It does not leave the structure unchanged. It distorts it, not by introducing something new, but by removing the relationship that gives it coherence. What appears continues to appear. Perception continues to function. The world remains structured at the level of becoming. But without the recognition of what underlies it, that structure is incomplete. It becomes self-contained, closed within its own terms. This is where false clarity and misplaced certainty arise. What is perceived feels sufficient. What is understood within that perception feels complete. There is no immediate indication that anything is missing. This is what allows ignorance to persist, not as confusion, but as stability. A stability that is convincing because it works within its own limits. This is why the text identifies it as the greatest problem. Not because it creates disorder, but because it creates a form of order that excludes what is most fundamental. This exclusion prevents alignment, because alignment depends on recognizing the relationship between what appears and what does not. Without that recognition, there is nothing to align with. What remains is a system that operates entirely within the field of becoming. This system can be detailed. It can be refined. It can become highly developed. But it remains incomplete, because it does not include the condition that allows it to exist. This is where reorientation becomes necessary, not as the addition of new information, but as the restoration of a relationship. The relationship between perception and intellect, between what changes and what does not, between what appears and what underlies it. This restoration does not alter what appears. It alters how it is understood. What was previously treated as self-sufficient is now recognized as dependent. What was taken as foundational is now understood as partial. This creates clarity. Not clarity in the sense of having more information, but clarity in the sense of holding the structure correctly. This clarity must be sustained, because the conditions that produce ignorance remain active. Perception continues to emphasize what changes. Attention continues to move toward what varies. Without the continued recognition of what underlies this, the structure begins to collapse again into appearance. This is why the treatise does not end with a resolution. It ends with a condition in which the structure has been clarified, the source of distortion has been identified, and the means of correction has been established, but must now be maintained. Not as belief, not as concept, but as clarity within experience. Clarity that what appears is not self-sufficient. Clarity that what does not appear is not therefore absent. Clarity that what underlies everything must remain recognized if understanding is to remain intact. From this position, the movement of the Corpus Hermeticum continues, not by introducing a new structure, but by approaching the same structure from new angles, each time requiring that it is held with the same level of precision. Because once ignorance has been identified, the task is no longer to avoid it. It is to remain clear of it. And that clarity is the only way the structure remains intact. Form. This distinction is precise, because the assumption that something perishes depends on identifying it entirely with its form. If a thing is understood only as what appears, then when that appearance changes or disappears, it is treated as though the thing itself has ended. This is where the misinterpretation begins, because what appears is not the entirety of what is. It is an expression, a configuration within the field of becoming. When that configuration changes, the expression changes. But the condition that allows it to exist does not. This is why the text states that nothing perishes, not because forms remain the same, but because what is does not depend on any single form. What appears is always in transition. It is constantly shifting, taking shape, dissolving, reconfiguring. This is not destruction. It is transformation. The difficulty arises because perception is tied to form. It identifies what appears and treats it as complete. When that form is no longer present, perception registers absence. This absence is interpreted as loss. But what is absent is not what is. It is the form that made it visible. This introduces a different understanding of continuity. Continuity is not the persistence of form. It is the persistence of what allows form to exist. This is not directly visible. It cannot be identified in the same way as what appears. And because of this, it is easily overlooked. What is seen becomes what is assumed to be real. What is not seen is treated as though it has ended. This is where the structure must be held carefully. Because if change is understood only at the level of appearance, then the world becomes a sequence of beginnings and endings. Things emerge from nothing and return to nothing. This creates a view of reality that is fragmented, discontinuous, dependent entirely on what can be perceived. The text does not support this. It maintains that what is does not emerge from nothing and does not return to nothing. It changes. This change is continuous. It does not involve the loss of being. It involves the transformation of form. This is where the idea of death must also be reconsidered. Because if nothing perishes, then what is called death cannot be the end of existence. It must be a change in the way existence is expressed. This does not remove the experience of loss. It redefines it. What is lost is the form. What remains is what allowed that form to exist. From this point, the text will begin to clarify how this transformation operates and how the misunderstanding of change leads to the belief that things come into being and pass away in an absolute sense. Because once change is understood correctly, the idea of destruction can no longer be held in the same way. And this is where the treatise continues. Once the initial statement has been clarified, the text moves toward a more precise distinction between what is commonly understood as destruction and what is actually taking place. This distinction is necessary because the language used to describe change often obscures the structure of what is occurring. Destruction implies an end. It suggests that something that existed has ceased to exist, that it has been removed from the structure of reality entirely. It carries with it the assumption that what is present can become absent in an absolute sense, that being can collapse into non-being. This is how perception interprets what it encounters. A form appears. It is recognized. It remains for a time. And then it is no longer present. From the perspective of perception, this sequence appears complete. Something has come into being and then it has passed away. The disappearance of the form is taken as the disappearance of the thing itself. The text challenges this interpretation by separating the form from what is. Form is how something appears. It is the configuration through which it becomes perceptible. It is not what is in itself. This is where the misunderstanding begins to dissolve. When a form changes or disappears, what is being altered is the configuration through which something is expressed. The appearance shifts. The arrangement of what is present is reconfigured. What was once visible in a particular way is no longer visible in that way. But this does not require that what is has ceased to exist. It requires only that it is no longer expressed in the same form. This is the difference between change and destruction. Change involves transformation. It is continuous. One form gives way to another. One configuration dissolves into a different arrangement. Nothing is lost. What is present remains present, but in a different expression. Destruction, as it is commonly understood, implies discontinuity. It suggests a break, a movement from being to non-being. The text does not support this, because if what is depends on a condition that does not change, then it cannot collapse into non-being. What does not change cannot be destroyed, and what changes depends on what does not change, which means it cannot move outside of that condition. This creates a continuous structure, one in which everything that appears is part of an ongoing process of transformation. Nothing emerges from nothing. Nothing returns to nothing. Everything moves within what is. This is difficult to hold because perception is oriented toward distinct forms. It identifies boundaries. It recognizes separation. It distinguishes between one thing and another. When those boundaries dissolve, perception registers absence. It does not register transformation. This is why destruction appears to be real, because the form that was recognized is no longer present. The continuity of what underlies that form is not directly visible, and so it is not included in the interpretation. This produces a fragmented view of reality, one in which existence is seen as a series of isolated events, each with a beginning and an end. The text replaces this with a continuous view. Not continuous in the sense that forms remain the same, but continuous in the sense that what is does not cease to be. This shift changes the way change itself is understood. Change is no longer the movement between being and non-being. It is the movement within being. This movement is constant. It does not stop. It does not reverse. It unfolds as a sequence of transformations, each dependent on what came before, and each giving rise to what follows. This removes the idea of absolute loss, not by denying that forms disappear, but by recognizing that disappearance is not equivalent to non-existence. This distinction must be maintained, because without it, the interpretation of experience remains tied to what is most immediate. What is seen becomes what is assumed. What is no longer seen becomes what is assumed to have ended. The text does not deny this experience. It corrects its interpretation. What is seen is real at the level of appearance. What is not seen is not therefore absent. This is the structure that must be held. From this point, the text moves toward how this continuous transformation relates to the idea of death, and how what is called death is understood when nothing is lost. Because once destruction is replaced with transformation, the meaning of ending must be reconsidered. And this is where the treatise continues. Once the distinction between change and destruction has been clarified, the idea of death must be reconsidered. Because if nothing that exists can truly perish, then what is commonly understood as death cannot be the end of existence. It must be something else. Death, as it is ordinarily understood, is tied to the disappearance of form. A body ceases to function. A presence that was once recognized is no longer there. What was familiar becomes absent. This absence is interpreted as an ending, as a final point beyond which nothing continues. This interpretation depends entirely on identifying the thing with its form. If a being is understood only as the configuration through which it appears, then the dissolution of that configuration is treated as the loss of the being itself. What was visible is no longer visible. What was active is no longer active. From the perspective of perception, the sequence appears complete. But this perspective is limited. It recognizes only what appears. It does not account for what allows appearance to occur. This is where the text introduces its correction. What is called death is not the end of existence. It is the end of a particular form of expression. This distinction is essential because it shifts the focus from what disappears to what remains. The form dissolves. The configuration changes. What was expressed in one way is no longer expressed in that way. But this does not require that what was expressed has ceased to be. It requires only that it is no longer present in the same form. This is consistent with the structure that has already been established. What comes into being changes. It does not remain fixed. Forms arise, persist for a time, and then transform. This transformation may involve the dissolution of a particular configuration, but it does not involve the loss of what allows that configuration to exist. This is where the illusion of death arises. Perception registers the loss of form. It does not register the continuity of what underlies that form. Because of this, it interprets transformation as ending. This interpretation is reinforced by the way experience is structured. What is familiar becomes unfamiliar. What was present becomes absent. This creates a sense of separation. A break. A movement from something to nothing. The text does not deny this experience. It redefines it. The break is not between being and non-being. It is between one form of expression and another. The absence that is perceived is not the absence of existence. It is the absence of a particular form. This is why death is described as an illusion. Not because nothing changes, but because the interpretation of that change is incomplete. What appears to end is the form. What does not end is what allowed that form to exist. This distinction does not remove the experience of loss. It reframes it. What is lost is not existence itself, but the way in which it was expressed. This introduces a different relationship to change. Change is no longer something that leads to disappearance. It is something that leads to transformation. This transformation is continuous. It does not involve the creation of something from nothing or the reduction of something into nothing. It involves the reconfiguration of what is. This is where the earlier structure must be held carefully. Because if transformation is not recognized, then the interpretation of death remains tied to appearance. What is seen becomes what is assumed. What is no longer seen becomes what is assumed to have ended. The text does not allow this assumption to remain. It requires that what is not seen is still recognized as present, even if it is no longer expressed in the same way. From this point, the treatise moves toward how this understanding affects the way existence itself is held within experience. Because once death is no longer understood as an ending, the continuity of what is must be recognized in a way that is not dependent on form. And this is where the structure continues to unfold. Once death is no longer understood as an ending, the question shifts again. It is no longer enough to recognize that forms change and that what is does not cease to exist. The focus becomes how continuity is understood when it is no longer tied to form. Continuity, in ordinary terms, is associated with persistence. Something is considered continuous when it remains the same over time, when it can be identified as the same thing from one moment to the next. This identification depends on stability of form. If the form changes significantly, continuity becomes uncertain. If the form disappears, continuity is treated as broken. This is how perception establishes consistency. It looks for what remains recognizable. It tracks identity through similarity. And when similarity is lost, it concludes that the thing itself is no longer present. The structure established in the earlier treatises does not support this method as sufficient, because what is does not depend on remaining the same at the level of form. Form is not fixed, it is constantly shifting. If continuity depended on form remaining unchanged, then continuity would be constantly interrupted. But this is not what the text describes. Continuity is not the persistence of form. It is the persistence of what allows form to exist. This is a different kind of continuity. It is not based on recognition through similarity. It is based on the constancy of what does not change. This constancy is not visible in the same way as form. It cannot be identified through comparison. It does not present itself as something that can be tracked across time as an object. And because of this, it is not recognized through the usual processes of perception. This is why continuity beyond form is difficult to hold. It requires a shift away from identifying what is through what appears. It requires recognizing that what appears is an expression of something that remains constant even as the expression changes. This does not remove the experience of difference. Forms still vary. Configurations still shift. What appears at one moment is not identical to what appears at another. But this variation does not interrupt continuity. It is part of it. Continuity includes change. It is not opposed to it. Because what remains constant is not the form, but the condition that allows form to exist. This condition does not change. It does not move from one state to another. It does not become something else. It remains what it is, regardless of the variations that occur within it. This is what provides continuity. Not the repetition of the same form, but the constancy of what underlies all forms. This understanding changes the way identity is approached. Identity is no longer tied exclusively to form. It is no longer dependent on remaining recognizable in the same way. It is understood in relation to what persists beyond form. This does not eliminate the use of form for identification within experience. It repositions it. Form becomes a way of engaging with what appears, not the basis for determining what is. This shift removes the sense that continuity is fragile. If continuity depends on form, then it is constantly at risk of being broken. Every change becomes a potential interruption. Every transformation appears as a loss of identity. If continuity is understood as dependent on what does not change, then transformation does not threaten it. It expresses it. This is where the structure must be held carefully. Because if continuity is reduced entirely to what underlies form, the connection to what appears can be lost. The world becomes abstract, disconnected from experience. At the same time, if continuity is tied only to form, then it becomes unstable. The text maintains both. What appears is real at the level of becoming. What underlies it is constant. Continuity exists at the level of what does not change. Transformation occurs at the level of what does. These two must be held together. From this point, the text moves toward how this understanding affects the interpretation of change within experience. Because once continuity is no longer tied to form, the way change is understood must also be adjusted. And this is where the treatise continues. Once continuity is no longer tied to the persistence of form, transformation can no longer be understood as a disruption. It must be understood as the way continuity is expressed within the field of becoming. This is a shift that requires precision. Because transformation is often interpreted as loss. When a form changes, what was previously recognized is no longer present in the same way. This creates a sense that something has been removed, that what existed has been diminished or replaced. This interpretation depends on identifying the thing entirely with its form. If the form is taken as complete, then any change in that form appears as a reduction. But if form is understood as expression, then change in form is not loss. It is reconfiguration. What is being altered is the way in which what is present is expressed, not the presence itself. This is where transformation must be recognized as continuous. It does not occur in isolated events. It is constant. Everything that appears is already in the process of becoming something else. There is no fixed point at which a form remains unchanged. Even what appears stable is in movement at levels that are not immediately visible. This movement does not introduce discontinuity. It maintains it, because what is moving is not moving from being to non-being. It is moving within being. This is what allows continuity to remain intact even as forms shift. Transformation is not something that interrupts existence. It is how existence unfolds at the level of form. This removes the idea that change is something that happens to things. It is what things are. To be at the level of becoming is to be in transformation. This is not a temporary condition. It is the nature of what appears. This understanding alters the interpretation of stability. Stability is no longer understood as the absence of change. It is understood as the presence of continuity within change. A form may appear stable, but it is still part of an ongoing process of transformation. Its apparent stability is a moment within that process, not a suspension of it. This is why the idea that something perishes cannot be maintained. Because what appears to end is not removed from existence. It is transformed. The configuration changes. The expression shifts. But what allows that expression remains. This must be held carefully. Because if transformation is understood only at the level of form, then it may still appear as a sequence of endings and beginnings. One form disappears, another appears, and this sequence is interpreted as discontinuous. The text does not support this interpretation. It maintains that transformation is continuous. There is no point at which being ceases. There is no moment of absolute loss. There is only the constant reconfiguration of what is. This is what allows the earlier statement to hold. That none of existing things perish, not because they remain the same, but because they do not cease to be. This distinction changes the way change itself is experienced. Change is no longer something that threatens continuity. It expresses it. This does not remove the experience of difference. It reframes it. Difference is no longer a sign of separation. It is a variation within continuity. This is where the structure must be maintained. Because if continuity is not recognized, transformation will continue to be interpreted as loss. And if transformation is interpreted as loss, the idea of destruction will return. The text prevents this by holding transformation within the structure of what does not change. What changes is always within what remains, and what remains is never affected by the changes that occur within it. From this point, the text moves toward its final movement, not to introduce something new, but to restate the structure in its most reduced form, now that change, death, and continuity have been clarified. Because once transformation is understood correctly, the idea of loss can no longer be held in the same way. And that is where the treatise comes to its conclusion. By the conclusion of this 8th treatise, the statement that opened it no longer stands in opposition to experience. That none of existing things perish has been clarified as a structural description of reality rather than a denial of what is observed. Forms change. They come into being, remain for a time, and then disappear. This sequence is real at the level of perception. What has changed is not the observation, but its interpretation. What disappears is not existence. It is form. This distinction has been held from multiple angles. Destruction has been separated from transformation. Death has been redefined as a change in expression. Continuity has been located in what does not change, rather than in the persistence of form. Transformation has been recognized as continuous, not as a series of isolated events. None of these ideas introduce something new. They refine the structure that has already been established. What appears is not self-sufficient. It depends on what underlies it. What underlies it does not change. And because it does not change, what appears cannot move outside of it. This is what prevents anything from perishing. Not because forms remain the same, but because being is not dependent on any single form. This removes the possibility of absolute loss, not by denying the experience of change, but by recognizing that change does not involve the movement from being to non-being. It involves the movement within being. This is where the earlier structure must be maintained. Because if what appears is treated as complete, then its disappearance will continue to be interpreted as ending. What is seen becomes what is assumed. What is no longer seen becomes what is assumed to have ceased. This interpretation remains tied to perception. It does not include what underlies perception. The text corrects this by restoring the relationship. What appears is real at its level. What underlies it is constant. The disappearance of form does not affect what allows form to exist. This is what must be held, not as an idea, but as clarity within experience. Clarity that what is visible is not the entirety of what is. Clarity that what is no longer visible is not therefore absent. Clarity that change does not remove being, but expresses it differently. This clarity does not remove variation. It situates it. Forms continue to change. Experience continues to unfold. What appears continues to shift. But none of this is treated as foundational. It is understood in relation to what does not change. This is what stabilizes understanding. Not the persistence of what appears, but the recognition of what remains, regardless of what appears. This recognition must be maintained, because the tendency to interpret change as loss remains active. Perception continues to prioritize what is visible. Attention continues to follow what varies. Without the continued recognition of what underlies this, the structure begins to collapse again into appearance. This is why the treatise does not end with a resolution. It ends with a condition. A condition in which the structure has been clarified, the interpretation of change has been corrected, and the continuity of what is has been recognized, but must now be held without distortion. From this position, the movement of the Corpus Hermeticum continues. Not by introducing a new structure, but by approaching the same structure from new angles, each time requiring that it is held with the same level of precision. Because once it is understood that nothing perishes, the task is no longer to prevent loss. It is to recognize that what is cannot be lost. And that recognition is the only way the structure remains intact within experience.